For years, Kevin Beets stood proudly beside his father, Tony Beets, the feared and respected king of the Klondike. Together, they built an empire of gold, machines, and power. But sometimes, the deepest cuts don't come from rivals. They come from a family. Whispers began spreading across the Yukon, whispers too wild to believe. And then, the truth broke out. Kevin Beets betrays Tony and teams up with Parker Schnabel for a $10 million deal. A revelation so shocking, it left both miners and fans stunned. The Beets family legacy, built on loyalty and iron will, now fractured by greed and ambition. Think about it. Parker Schnabel, Tony's greatest competitor, suddenly gains an ally who knows every detail of the Beets operation. It's not just a deal, it's a weapon. A betrayal that could topple the king and crown a new ruler in the unforgiving goldfields. And this is only the beginning. The fallout is darker, deeper, and far more disturbing than anyone imagined. But before we dive deep into the full story behind this shocking twist, make sure you subscribe and turn on notifications, because what you're about to discover will change everything you thought you knew about the gold rush. For decades, one name echoed through the frozen valleys and rugged creeks of the Yukon: Tony Beets. Known across the mining world as the king of the Klondike, Tony built his empire not with luck, but with grit, determination, and an unrelenting will. He was larger than life, a man both feared and respected, admired and envied. Around him, machines thundered, dredges groaned, and fortunes were pulled from the ground by sheer force of will. But Tony never stood alone. His empire was a family empire, and at its heart stood his children, Kevin, Monica, and Mike. The Beets family was more than just a mining operation. They were a dynasty in motion. Kevin, Tony's eldest, stood as the natural heir to the throne. Monica, equally tough, carved her place as a sharp and capable miner in her own right, while Mike contributed to the growing machine that was Paradise Hill. Together, under Tony's iron rule, they formed a unit few could challenge. To rivals, the Beets were unstoppable. To crews, they were the standard by which all others were measured. And to viewers around the world, they were the embodiment of raw ambition turned into gold. Day after day, the scene rarely changed. Engines roared across the frozen ground, pay dirt cascaded onto conveyor belts, and nuggets of gold piled into pans under the harsh northern sun. Outsiders saw only power, discipline, and results, a family bound by loyalty, pushing forward season after season. Paradise Hill itself became more than land. It became a fortress, a monument to both Tony's pride and the Beets' collective strength. But while the surface gleamed with gold, shadows lingered beneath. Kevin, though seen as the rightful successor, began to feel the invisible weight pressing down on his shoulders. Every success was not his own, but credited to his father's leadership. Every idea for innovation clashed against Tony's old-school approach, and every failure, no matter how small, bore his name. The crown of the Beets empire was heavy, and Kevin was expected to wear it, but only on Tony's terms. The cracks in the dynasty were small at first, almost invisible. A disagreement was dismissed. A frustrated glance ignored. The unspoken tension of a son who wanted change and a father who demanded obedience. But cracks, once they form, grow deeper. And behind the walls of Paradise Hill, ambition and resentment quietly took root. The Beets dynasty was mighty, yes, but no empire, no matter how strong, is immune to fracture. And soon, the silence would give way to conflict. Father and son, once united in gold, were about to find themselves on opposite sides of a storm that threatened to tear their world apart. Behind the cameras and the public image of the Beets family's unshakable unity, a different story began to unfold. On the surface, they were a dynasty, a well-oiled machine of miners, each playing their part in Tony's empire. But when the cameras stopped rolling and the noise of the machinery fell silent, the cracks beneath that tough exterior became harder to hide. Tony Beets had built his kingdom on tradition, hard work, brute force, and an uncompromising belief in his way of mining. To him, success was about loyalty, discipline, and respect for the methods that had carried him from humble beginnings to the throne of the Klondike. But for Kevin, his eldest son, those same methods were chains. Kevin grew restless under his father's rule. He had a vision of the future: faster machines, innovative techniques, a more efficient way of mining that could push the Beets empire even further. Yet every time he raised his voice, it was silenced. Every idea was dismissed, drowned out by Tony's booming authority. What Tony saw as protecting tradition, Kevin saw as suffocation. Their clashes became sharper, more frequent. Arguments that once ended quickly now dragged on, echoing across the claim. Crew members whispered about father and son screaming at each other in the dirt. Kevin pushing for change, Tony demanding obedience. For Tony, the crown could not be shared. For Kevin, wearing that crown on his father's terms was no longer enough. Resentment grew like a fire beneath the surface. Kevin no longer viewed himself as a helper or apprentice. He began to see himself as the rightful leader, the one who could take the Beets name into a new age of mining. But with every passing season, that dream seemed further out of reach, buried under the weight of his father's shadow. It was a battle of vision versus tradition, ambition versus control, and in the end, only one could win. The silence between father and son thickened. The tension became unbearable, and slowly, Kevin began to look beyond Paradise Hill for opportunities of his own. Meetings were arranged, conversations held in quiet corners, far from his father's reach. Whispers of betrayal began to stir, faint at first, then louder with every passing day. Because this was no longer just a clash of ideas, it was the beginning of a rebellion. And soon, the Yukon would discover that Kevin Beets was prepared to do the unthinkable. In the Yukon, secrets never stay buried for long. The frozen ground may hold its gold tight, but whispers travel quickly through the mining camps, bars, and back roads. And soon, those whispers began to circle around Kevin Beets. At first, it was nothing more than small observations. Kevin disappearing from Paradise Hill for hours, sometimes days. He was spotted in towns, away from the family claim, meeting with people no one could quite place. To outsiders, it might have seemed harmless, but to those who knew the Beets family well, these quiet disappearances were alarming. Kevin was a son, raised in the heart of the Beets empire. His life was supposed to revolve around the family business, the operation, and above all, loyalty to his father. Anything outside that orbit immediately drew suspicion. Soon the rumors began to spread like wildfire. Miners whispered of Kevin's growing frustration, his hunger for independence, his desire to finally step out from under his father's towering shadow. The stories grew bolder with every retelling. Kevin was plotting something that could change everything. And then a name surfaced, one that sent shockwaves through the Yukon. Parker Schnabel. The idea was unthinkable. Tony's greatest rival, the man he openly mocked and fought against. The young miner he saw as competition rather than equal. For Kevin to even be in the same room as Parker was dangerous. For him to be negotiating, it was unholy. The camps buzzed with disbelief. Could Tony's own son really be aligning with the enemy? But the whispers refused to die. Night after night, they grew louder, traveling from claim to claim until they could no longer be ignored. Kevin, the loyal heir, the son of the king, was preparing to do the unthinkable, step away from his father's empire and walk into the arms of his father's sworn adversary. This was no longer idle talk. It was the beginning of something far greater. The first ripples of a betrayal that would shake the entire Yukon. And while Tony remained in the dark, unaware of the storm brewing just beyond his reach, Kevin was already taking the steps that would alter the course of his family forever. Because whispers, once they begin, rarely fade. They build, they gather strength, and in time, they explode into truth. And soon, that truth would reveal itself in the most shocking way possible. As Kevin Beets and Parker Schnabel prepared to forge a deal that would change the balance of power in the Klondike forever. At first, it seemed like nothing. Just two miners crossing paths in the Yukon. Parker Schnabel and Kevin Beets exchanging words in passing. A laugh here, a handshake there. To the untrained eye, it was harmless. Rivals talk, crews mingle, and the mining world is small enough that encounters are inevitable. No one thought twice. But beneath the surface, something far more dangerous was beginning to take shape. Parker, sharp-eyed and relentless, recognized opportunity when it stood before him. Kevin was not just another miner, he was Tony Beets's son, raised in the heart of the Beets empire, with knowledge that few men on earth possessed. Knowledge of ground, of secrets, of weaknesses. In Kevin, Parker saw more than a rival's son. He saw leverage. Kevin, meanwhile, was fighting a battle of his own. Years of working under his father's iron grip had left him restless, searching for freedom. Tony's empire was vast, but it was also suffocating. Every move Kevin made, every decision he tried to shape, was overruled by the king of the Klondike. And then came Parker. Young, ambitious, but willing to let Kevin carve his own path. For the first time, Kevin glimpsed the independence. What began as casual conversations soon turned into strategy. Behind closed doors, in hushed meetings away from prying eyes, a pact was born. A staggering $10 million partnership, built not on loyalty, but on ambition. With Kevin's knowledge of the Beets operation and Parker's relentless drive, the two believed they could reshape mining power in the Yukon forever. It was a deal sealed in silence. No public announcements, no open displays of allegiance. Just two men, one breaking free, the other seizing opportunity, bound together by shared ambition. But while the alliance grew in strength, one man remained in the dark. Tony Beets, the patriarch, the empire builder, the father whose very name carried weight across the Klondike. He had spent decades fighting rivals, conquering claims, and protecting his family's dominance. Never once did he imagine that the greatest threat would not come from outside his walls, but from within them. The Yukon is no stranger to storms, fierce, violent, and unforgiving. But the one now building inside the Beets empire would be unlike any Tony had ever faced. Because when betrayal comes from blood, it cuts the deepest, and soon, the storm Tony feared most would break loose, shattering his empire, testing his family, and forcing the king of the Klondike into a fight not just for power, but for survival. The Yukon has seen Tony Beets angry before. Machines break, ground runs dry, and men make mistakes. But nothing compared to the storm that erupted the day he learned the truth. Word spread fast. Whispers confirmed what once seemed unthinkable. Kevin, his own blood, had forged an alliance with Parker Schnabel. For Tony, this was more than betrayal. This was humiliation. The king of the Klondike, undermined not by an enemy, but by his heir. The empire he had built with sweat, grit, and sacrifice now trembled at its foundation. Crews watched in silence as Tony's fury boiled over. His voice thundered across the claims, orders barked, equipment slammed. The rage of a man who had spent decades conquering the unforgiving Yukon now turned inward against his own. To Tony, every decision Kevin had made, every secret meeting with Parker, was a knife in the back. Pride, the one thing he carried above gold itself, had been wounded. And with that wound came fire. He had not clawed his way to the top of the mining world to be mocked, to be usurped, to watch his crown slip away. But this was no ordinary power struggle. This was family. Monica and Mike stood caught in the crossfire, torn between loyalty to their father and the bonds of blood with their brother. Every heated exchange threatened to split not just the crew, but the very heart of the Beets dynasty. For the first time in years, cracks that had once been whispers now split wide open for all to see. Kevin, in Tony's eyes, was no longer the son who had worked beside him through brutal winters and endless dredge runs. He was a traitor, a rival, a man who dared to stand against the dynasty that raised him. And if Kevin believed he could walk away unscathed, he had underestimated the wrath of his father. Because betrayal within the Beets family was not just personal, it was a war. The Yukon was about to witness a clash not between miners, but between generations. Between a king unwilling to surrender his throne and a son determined to claim his place. And as the Beets empire fractured, one question remained. Would this family war destroy them all, or forge something even more dangerous in its ashes? The answer would come with the breaking storm. Fallout is never immediate. It seeps slowly, like poison through the veins of an empire. And for the Beets family, the aftermath of Kevin's betrayal was not just a moment, it was a reckoning. Monica and Mike Beets, once pillars of strength beside their father, now found themselves caught in the middle of a war they never wanted. To stand with Tony meant turning against their brother. To side with Kevin meant defying the father who had built their world. Every meal, every meeting, every whispered exchange carried the weight of mistrust. The Beets household, once a fortress, was now a battlefield of divided loyalties. The crews felt it too. Men who had worked for years under Tony's command now hesitated, unsure which side of history to stand on. In the Yukon, loyalty is survival. But when the very family leading you fractures, even the ground beneath your boots feels uncertain. Whispers drifted through the camps, murmurs of betrayal, fear, and speculation. Would the Beets dynasty survive this split? Or was it already broken, beyond repair? For Tony, the fight was no longer just about gold. It was about identity, about protecting a legacy he had carved out of frozen ground and unforgiving winters. Every order he gave now came with an edge of desperation, a need to remind his crew, and perhaps himself, that he was still the king of the Klondike. Kevin, meanwhile, only pressed deeper into his alliance with Parker Schnabel. The further he pushed, the more irreversible the fracture became. It was no longer just a son breaking away. It was a son rewriting the future, aligning with his father's greatest rival, reshaping the balance of mining power in the Yukon. The scars forming now would not fade easily. Family bonds had been torn, trust had been shattered, and a dynasty, once unshakable, now stood on trembling ground. But in the Yukon, fractures are more than personal wounds. They're opportunities. And while Tony fought to hold his empire together, Parker and Kevin were already planning their next move, a strike bold enough to shift the future forever. Because this wasn't just a family divided. This was the beginning of a power struggle that would redraw the lines of the entire mining world. And soon, the Yukon would feel the full weight of the storm unleashed. In the Yukon, power is measured not just in ounces of gold, but in legacy. And when Kevin Beets shook hands with Parker Schnabel, it was more than an agreement. It was an earthquake, a seismic shift that rattled the foundations of mining power across the north. Rivals who had watched the Beets dynasty dominate for decades now stared in disbelief. Around campfires, in bars, and in the frozen claims, the whispers spread. Some called it the dawn of a new empire, a bold partnership that could outmatch anyone in the field. Others saw it as the downfall of an old one, the crumbling of a family once considered unshakable. For Parker, the alliance was a weapon. With Kevin's insider knowledge of the Beets operation, he suddenly gained an edge no rival could match. Ground that had once seemed untouchable was now vulnerable. Weaknesses once hidden beneath the weight of Tony's authority were exposed. For the first time, Parker wasn't just competing with Tony Beets. He was positioned to overtake him. But for Tony, the cost was more than strategic. It was personal. Stripped of his heir, the man who should have carried his name and legacy into the next generation, Tony now faced not only betrayal, but the battle of his life. Every move Parker and Kevin made threatened to chip away at the empire he had bled to build. The king of the Klondike stood cornered, not by strangers, but by his own blood. The Yukon itself seemed to hold its breath. Crews braced, knowing that peace would not hold. This was not just a rivalry, it was war. A war for dominance, for pride, for the very future of mining in the north. And while Kevin believed he had broken free, and Parker believed he had found his greatest ally, the truth was far more dangerous. Betrayal had been completed, but consequences were only just beginning. Because in the unforgiving Yukon, power never comes without a price. And as alliances hardened and empires trembled, one thing became clear. This land would not hold two kings for long. The Yukon was shaken forever. But the true storm, the war that would decide its future, was only just about to begin.